Okay, welcome everybody. This is a discussion of Pathwork lectures. I call it the Wisdom of the Pathwork Guide. And I just like to, summarize the lecture and then we read through it in the guide's own energy and voice and discuss and, people can stop and comment or ask questions at any point. And so I'm gonna just share our summary for tonight's lecture, which is uh, Pathwork Lecture 250. Sometimes these come to me out of the blue. This one came to my attention and I just felt drawn. I haven't even read it since I, was called to it. So we'll see where it goes. But it's called Inner Awareness of Grace. And then the subtitle is Exposing the Deficit. And this was given on April 19th, 1978. And it explores how humans block themselves from experiencing spiritual grace and fulfillment by clinging to a hidden inner sense of deficit. And then there's an emotional withholding and a refusal to really be open to give and receive. So the core concepts of this inner deficit, where we harbor a false and deeply ingrained in belief that, somehow we're empty or we're not enough or we're deprived or lacking. And this sense of a deficit is actually maintained by our own refusal to let go of this, kind of a negativity and a negative pleasure and share ourselves with others. So, when we feel deprived and lacking, we often don't feel like, we have anything to share with people, and so some of it is that, but he's saying, that there's a withholding and so it's like if we can challenge ourselves maybe to risk and to share more of ourselves, that's one way. And then giving and receiving unity is another core concept. So true spiritual maturity realizes that giving and receiving are not two separate acts, but a single interchangeable movement. And so when you block yourself from giving out of fear of loss or out of insufficiency, right, you simultaneously shut down your capacity to receive grace, joy, and fulfillment. And underlying this can even be a fear of bliss. So because love and divine bliss are inherently connected, people who are closed emotionally end up fearing bliss itself. Experiencing grace requires exposing where we hold onto inner poverty and control. So let me share our lecture and we'll go to that. We have to, oops, wrong way. And let's see if we can, I don't know if we can make this bigger. Let's see. Used to be, oh, it's 100%. There it goes. Okay. Is that a little easier to see? Oops, that's too big. Let's bring it back down. Okay. That looks like about right. So hopefully that helps. So, greetings and blessings, my very beloved friends. The joy of seeing your community develop and expand is enormous. We praise the Lord for this wonder that springs from your personal growth, from your commitment and devotion to serve a cause that goes far beyond yourselves. So the guide is speaking to the gathering of people that came live to hear this channel, speak these lectures. And it was kind of a study community, that really realized that this was a path. And so they were learning directly from the guide as well as doing sessions with Eva. So now he says, I wish to speak. That Eva called the guide a he. The guide said that there were many, many beings that were involved in creating these lectures. So probably, if I could remember, it would be better, better to say the guide, they, or the guides or something. But, it's like, I think it was not really clear, and the guy did not give a name or anything like that. So basically, he was saying, don't really concern yourself from where this comes from, but pay attention to the lectures and the content. And if it connects, or if it seems to make sense and even challenge you in a good way, he said, go ahead, try it on for size. And so it's a kind of direct experiential path, and there's nothing here to believe or anything. So going into the lecture, the guide says, now I wish to speak about the meaning of grace. For many of you, this is a difficult concept to comprehend. In former times, the concept of grace was much more acceptable, for it was understood as a special dispensation from God that was given or not given for his own reasons. The individual had little to do with it. At a time when self-responsibility was little developed, grace was interpreted in this manner and was therefore easier to accept. In the present general state of humanity, self-responsibility is much more developed. You understand that you create your reality and your experiences, good or bad. So how then does grace come in? Is it totally eliminated from your vision of life and reality? No, it is not. Grace is as much a reality as self-creation and self-responsibility, and they are by no means mutually exclusive. I wish to give you some perspective on the subject, which will then open up another equally important topic, that of faith. The grace of God is. It exists at all times, penetrating all that is. It exists in the very nature of ultimate reality, which is thoroughly benign. Grace means that all work must work out for the best, no matter how evil, how painful, how tragic things may appear in the moment. In the end, when people have lived through and fully assimilated the negative experiences, they come around full circle to the light of love, truth, joy, peace, pleasure, supreme eternal life and well-being in all respects. This must always be the ultimate reality, and therein lies grace. So truly you cannot help but live in the grace of God. The very air you breathe is permeated with it. Every substance of life on all levels, from the finest vibrations and radiations to the crudest matter, is permeated with it. The very world you live in, the universe, all of creation, the way divine law is constructed, all are expressions of divine grace. You live and move and have your being in a universe that consists of such tenderness, such love, such personal care of the living God, of the eternal presence in all that is, that it simply defies description. You are surrounded by a universe in which there is simply nothing ever to fear, no matter what the momentary appearances may be. So, I mean, this is something I need to hear these days, How is this landing for anybody? Any comments or questions here?
Yeah, it's kind of new for me, but I'm sensing that I'm doing the Eckhart Tolle New Earth, and somebody asked a question. It reminds me of your deep dive where you go to the feeling sense, and that's where God can dissolve the blocks. And Eckhart was talking about the meditative state as not something to get you somewhere, but to just become aware of the same life energy that's in our inner body is filling the space around us. And it's just helped me become more aware of that.
Uh-huh. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it just, like I think the one that struck me a little bit, and because it's like, it's something that, like to really feel safe, I mean, this world is a great mystery. We don't know what's going to happen next, good things and bad things, but it's like, I think the normal state would be somewhat, anxious in a way, right? And so this is, I think, like how we mostly are, even sometimes we're suppressing it or we're displacing it in some way, but um, to understand that, we really are safe, or that, this is all, like you're saying, grace means that all must work out for the best, no matter how evil, how painful, how tragic things may appear at the moment. And so to kind of trust in the movement through, the guide says in other lectures, like the lower self is always temporary. And,
Mhm.
so this gives me some comfort, in these days, and, also like, to realize that it's in some ways holding all of this and going through it is part of the curricula and helps us, understand and make choices and, really be a part of, I think, the healing and the creation of the new earth, right? So,
Yes. Yeah. I had three things come up that were kind of crises that were my cat almost died. And then I had two other big things come up, and it activated really old terror, paralyzing terror. And if I couldn't have faith that the ultimate reality is thoroughly benign, I don't think I would have been able to tolerate the feelings, meet them, ask for the help, to take one step at a time to deal with each thing. And because, my cat was a rescue, she had been feral. And every time I had to put her in the carrier, it felt like a betrayal of our original contract, to get her to the vet. And she would have died otherwise. And anyway, but I really had to have faith that the ultimate, otherwise, it was the strength I needed to take each step was seemingly beyond me without that faith.
exactly. And, so I find that in general, like when I am in crisis,
Yes.
it's more, I sense that presence, and it does feel like, I don't know, somehow with crisis, all your angels are surrounding you and helping you in some way. And it's harder when it's like the sort of the everyday grinder, the everyday
Yes.
challenges and stuff like that, or the fears that I get triggered on the news and stuff. So, but yeah, and to understand that even grace is in that all in some way, and I have, more encroaching civilization in my woods, and, like part of me, is protective, and it feels sort of like, I want to, like that's a bad thing for nature, right? But at some level, it's happening. I don't know why it's happening. I don't like it, but maybe at some level that I don't understand, it is what is the best. I think, even when things are going not so well, and everything is, I think the universe is in this process of, you know, moving at the highest and the most, generous place it can be. And so, even when it's pretty dicey, or maybe we're, going through something, big contraction, something like that, there's just something about the fact that meeting that, and finding our way, I think it's kind of part of the curricula, part of what develops us, the guide says, we can never really understand, like we see through a little keyhole. And that's one of the things, because there's a part of my mind that I think I know everything, right? And so I have to, remember to kind of be humble in that,
Yes.
and not think I know so much. Because
Hmm.
I notice when I do that, I tend to, like sort of get arrogant. And
Right. It cuts us off from that subtler sense that we're in God.
exactly.
We're up here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the mind, yeah, it's a defense, knowing is a kind of defense, right? And so,
Yeah.
it's not present. It's not like Susan's book Undefended, it's not my undefended self, it's like in that
Hmm.
place.
Hmm.
So,
Good point. Yeah.
okay, well, good. Anything else before we move on? So he says the problem is not that you need to draw the grace of God to you, for it is already there, filling every pore of your being. The problem is your lack of vision, your limited view, your distorted interpretations, your faulty outlook, and your personal blocks. These seem like walls of iron which enclose you and prevent you from perceiving and experiencing grace. In reality, the walls are mist and must immediately dissolve once you rearrange your field of vision and thus begin to dissolve your personality defects and blocks. As always, this process begins with small everyday events. As I so often said to you, you can easily tell whether you are in truth or not by the way you feel. This gauge is always right at your disposal. If you are in harmony with life, if you are joyous and hopeful, you can be certain that you partake of God's grace that surrounds and permeates you, and that you are in truth, at least in the limited way of your present state of consciousness, regarding your immediate experiences and reactions to the world around you. But when the opposite occurs, when you are in a state of disturbance, fear, and disharmony within yourself, with others, and life in general, you forget this key. I wish you would all choose to remember using it. Impregnate yourself with this truth in your daily meditations. When you are unhappy, fearful, discouraged, in darkness, know at least that you are not in truth. This will make a lot of difference. Like we merge and we identify with these thought forms that say, oh, this is bad, or, this is, I'm give up, it's too hard, or, something terrible, the fear, the unhappiness. So, they're kind of these, negative states and attachments. And so, as we work with, these blocks, that understanding that, no, this is just not the truth, right? And the guide is always telling us, to ask inside, ask the higher, ask what is the truth, especially when we're in a split and confusion. And usually there's a way that truth is on both sides of things as well as its distortion. And so we have to kind of separate that out. But it is a beautiful question to always ask, what is the truth? And so when you know that your blocks and your faulty vision have separated you from the grace of God, in which you swim even now, although you do not know it. So, like he's kind of saying, it's like, again, maybe pointing to faith, right? If we know that it's there, but it's just, we can't feel it because we're too uptight, or we have these traumas that we're holding, and so we're tensing or whatever. We can't quite believe in it somehow because, you know, each of us has our reasons why, our skeptic, I think the inner skeptic is a useful part too. But sometimes, it also, blocks us from trusting in this bigger thing. But in a way, there's nothing else we can do. We're all part of it, and there's not any way that we can separate ourselves out from it, or whatever it's gonna put us through, or whatever is gonna happen next. It's like, and so this is where, in some ways, that surrender process is part of what we're trying to learn to do. And it's
There's
easiest.
something that the guide said that really stuck with me about how to tell if I'm in truth or not, and that's me versus the other means I'm not in truth. There's
Right.
this discord. And that I and others are one is the truth. And that helps me be able to really step back and open to something else coming in that will harmonize whatever is discordant or, not true.
Uh-huh.
Not always easy. Not always easy, but
Right. And there's that's definitely a beautiful way of working with it. And you can explore some of that discord, as a way of understanding more, and I think again the truth sets us free, to understand and see where the source and the, reason for the confusion or the, part of us that is, it's always like a split, so there's divinity and distortion.
mhm,
And to claim the divinity, I think is great. And then we can also most fully, I think, release the distortion by fully understanding, where it came from, what it, how it works for us, and how it was, a confusion that, I mean, we had no control over. It was kind of like we brought that in,
mhm,
and it was a part of the perfection of our life in some way, right?
mhm. Part of the lesson plan.
Yeah. So yeah, and so there's this way that I still like this, image that he keeps offering here, it's like we're just swimming in this grace of God. And to me
Yeah.
that's a very sort of kinesthetic invitation, like it's a feeling state of consciousness that sometimes, and I can actually experience, right? And most of it comes when I'm like deeply, deeply surrendered and relaxed.
Mhm,
And then, also that's what I was, like this is a beautiful thing. If we know that this is here, surrender becomes much easier. We resist surrender because we think it's going to be something, other than the grace of God. It's going to mean our, demise in some way.
demise, yes.
So, how are you doing, Chuck? We'll keep
Good.
going. So your habit of putting effect before cause creates gross misconceptions and misinterpretations of life that prevent you from experiencing grace. The automatic habit of this reverse thinking extends to many different issues and aspects of reality. One example is the assumption that the experience of God's grace is something to be given to you. Another assumption is that faith comes also from outside, as if one day something would be added onto you. Well, right now you lack it. You lack neither grace nor faith. As everything else, they too already exist in you. If only you could begin to think of yourself in these terms, all would fall into place. You have a notion of the theory, but in your habitual thinking, you resist its truth. You think of yourself as an empty vessel that needs to be filled. So we're thinking, in terms of not lacking, that we already have all of these things, within us. And he's saying, like if we can open to that possibility and kind of help it replace this idea that we're some kind of an empty vessel, right? That we don't have what we need, that we aren't enough. You might just tune in, it's like we all have this place in us to some degree, and it hasn't been worked on more or less, but there's this, way that in some sense it's true, from the human 3D physical body self, right? we are not enough, and this is a big and strange and intense place, right? So, and yet that is not all of who we are. So what I like to do with this, because I don't like to deny or kind of rise over anything in me. I like to just acknowledge, okay, so there is this place, that does feel like it's less than enough in this big world. And, it has fear, it has insecurity, it, feels like things are very threatening in a lot of ways. And so, this part, I don't have to say it's right or wrong, good or bad, but I can just acknowledge, yeah, you're there, this is here. And somehow when I just accept it being a part and here, then, it doesn't become as big. It's like a part of me relaxes and my body kind of comes down a little, and there's more space inside, and less of the tension of that. And so, first of all, I would acknowledge the part of me that does feel or think of itself as an empty vessel that needs to be filled. I wouldn't try to reject it or get rid of it or, deny it. And I wouldn't try to fix it if I know it's there and try to figure it out and make it different. I would just first acknowledge it and, accept that this is a part of me and it's here to whatever degree it's here. And so then once we do that, there's movement potentially, and an openness comes a little more. And so to continue, like, becoming then implies acquiring something that you do not possess already. And in some ways, we're always both being and becoming, right? But that is the journey of becoming, right? Is to expand, to go beyond where we already are. In reality, you are already that you could ever wish to be. You already possess the states of consciousness you aim to attain. It is simply that only a limited part of your total self functions on the level of reality into which you were born. So, it's like, it's in a way a beautiful duality too, but it's also a unity. Like there's this, if we were just being and not becoming, it would be like just one half of the journey in some ways, and then if we were just always becoming, but we had no ground in being, so there's this beautiful balancing of these two forces. Maybe they're even connected with the masculine and feminine forces in the universe. I think that in some ways they remind me or reflect that. So saying, it is your task to gradually release these parts of you that fully exist on another level of reality. So in a sense, what I would say is we're incarnating more and more of our spiritual, capacity, our spiritual gifts, our spiritual consciousness, our capacity and presence, and so that's one of the tasks that we came in to do, was incarnate as fully as possible, as us, right? And so we need to be brought into the material level, and like all of our beauty, all of our, spiritual, heartfelt, love, connection, all of that, it's like it's like we're trying to bring that into the material level. And to me, that's sort of it. Instead of leaving to find spirit, we're bringing spirit into the earth in some way. And so it is also our task to gradually release those parts of you that exist. So that's what I read, so we're trying to, he says, by release, it's bringing them in into this material level. The lower self exists precisely because of the limitation with which you manifest on this level of reality. Expansion, growth, development, all these terms mean only one thing: to bring forth the perfection of what you already are in essence. So we're not adding anything to ourselves, we're blossoming. We're trying to bring our fullness or our true self more and more into, our life. And if you could think of this process more as releasing what is already there rather than as becoming something that you are not, that is still foreign to you, you would aid your process considerably. So you can release your intrinsic awareness of grace. You can release the faith that is already in you, the knowledge that you live in a tender universe, shaped out of personal love and caring, that there is nothing to fear. You know, the universe knows you personally. Can you kind of open to that? You know, does that ring true, or do you feel still like a grain of sand in the immensity of it all, and that you don't matter, ultimately, or something like that, or your mattering is little? And in some ways, there's a lot out there to matter, but it's kind of like, do you feel this tenderness of the universe towards you? And all of this is shaped out of the personal love and caring, and that there is nothing to fear. So if you visualize in this way, you will release new awareness, new knowledge, new faith, new ways of reacting that will surprise you and fill you with wonder and joy. So I think there's something here that he's saying, where if we visualize it this way, we'll release new awareness, new knowledge, new faith, and new ways of reacting. Like if you look up above, it's kind of like I stumbled over it, but I think, this knowledge that we live in a tender universe shaped out of personal love and caring. So this tender universe kind of that surrounds us, is shaped by our, personal could be, personal towards us, but I think it's also our own, capacity and personal love and caring. And it's not just for the universe or others, but for ourselves as well. And so what I noticed and remembered, was like when I stopped identifying with the inner critic as the God in me, and recognized, that this, kind of unhappy part that was always, frustrated with me was not God, but sort of a God image that, seemed to dominate. And so then I began to open, and as I began to, see myself in compassion, understand the depths of, the difficulty of the journey, and not think I should somehow be better, right? Or done it better, or, that I was not doing it right. There's a way that all became a kind of self-love, a way of, knowing that I work hard, I do the best I can, I'm totally flawed, I make a lot of mistakes, but that the universe is here. I'm a child, I'm learning, and the universe is here, allowing that, giving me freedom, giving me experience, and it's not judging, it's it's not um anything but tender. And if we run into something that's difficult or painful or whatever like that, it's like we tend to project maybe that, the universe is punishing us or something. But I think it's really, like, again, this tender universe, gently as it can be, trying to help us grasp or understand something that, we're blocked in. And so we're coming up against the block, and then we resist, and so it gets difficult. What are the obstacles to releasing the faith, the knowledge, the awareness already existing within you? The first block is your not knowing that you possess this awareness, this faith. The knowledge must be cultivated. It has to begin in your outer brain and thinking. Just considering the possibility that there is nothing to fear, that you live in an utterly benign universe, that you are filled with the living God, will make you automatically challenge your fears, your doubts, your distrust, and your negative beliefs. So just kind of entertaining this possibility can then help us question, something that seems sort of unquestionable, right? and just having that space, stepping back, wondering, asking, that is a crack that can help us, transform the world. So this in turn will make it easier for you to sufficiently trust life and its laws so that you will risk giving. And this is indeed an important lever that touches an inexorable law of life. For only as you give out of yourself, from and with your heart, can you truly receive. You have heard the law of giving and receiving discussed many times. It is such an important law that it is taught in all the religious scriptures that ever existed. Yet it is usually misunderstood, or at least slightly but sufficiently distorted, so that you put it aside. You believe it is a sanctimonious edict issued forth by an arbitrary authority that makes demands on you, and then possibly rewards you with something in return. You see it as a form of bargaining. You resist the concept because it offends human dignity. You distrust a universe that is pedagogic and treats the individual as an unruly child, though it is surely not your true personality and your real being who believes this distortion. So, and sometimes I think, like we have this confusion too, like a lot of times we grew up with a love mask, and so we've been giving in order to get, right? And that hasn't worked so well, and so then, we want to receive first, and so there's this, confusion, I think, around a lot of it in the love mask too. So what does the law of giving and receiving mean in reality? Every human being contains a built-in mechanism that makes receiving quite impossible when the soul withholds its innate capacity and yearning to give. So, and most people I know feel this even acutely, that we have a yearning to give. Have you felt that? I mean, there was a period of time when things were kind of slow here at the retreat, and it really felt like I had this huge yearning to give, right? And it just was not being met. But I feel like now I'm being well used, so that's good, So, but, tune in your own experience, and notice, like, and maybe it's not there, and that just means not that you don't have it, but, there's defense and there's, pain bodies and trauma connected with it and blocks, and so it has to be unraveled in a way. So we're distrustful, fearful, holding. Oh, I think maybe not quite there yet. Let me make sure. Since in reality, giving and receiving are one and the same flow and movement, one cannot exist without the other. Where distrustful, fearful holding back makes it impossible for the soul to enter into the flow of universal life and movement, kind of participating in life, right? Engagement. The total process of giving and receiving is stopped, so that the grace of God with all its manifestations cannot enter into the consciousness of the personality. So in some ways we block it, and it is as though all the riches were there, ready to be tasted and experienced, but the hand could not reach for them. The senses could not perceive them. The brain cannot even observe their vivid reality. It is as though the whole personality with all its perceptions were dulled, so that the total vision of life is distorted. This strengthens the illusion that you live in a poor, empty universe. It increases the belief that your inner universe is equally poor and empty, that you have nothing to give from within and nothing to receive from without. As you know, every attitude, every mental and emotional condition creates chain reactions and circles, either benign or vicious ones. According to the truth or error of your belief, attitude, and behavior pattern. When you are in the illusion that both the outer and the inner universe are empty and impoverished, you automatically create a vicious circle. This belief must make you hoard yourself, your innate riches, talents, everything you possess, spiritually or materially. You are holding in rather than giving out. Here you separate yourself from the riches that surround and penetrate you. So that was that, image in the meditation. The inner mechanism makes your receiving impossible. It strengthens and finally seems to confirm your vision of poverty, of life and self. So does that make sense how that vicious circle happens?
Mhm.
In contrast, the benign circle can be established by risking giving out, in the conscious expectation that abundance will grow because the fear of poverty and deprivation may be illusory. As you start giving to God in trust and with love, you release the inner faith and you liberate your clouded vision. And you will not only then see the abundance surrounding you and flowing through you, but you will also lift the lever that locked the mechanism. And you will reach out into the rich world and allow it to bestow upon you all that it contains in overpowering abundance, given to you by the Creator with limitless love. Words can never describe this magnificence. By risking giving out, you enter into a benign circle. You can afford to release more of your inner and outer riches because you know they are eternally and inexorably replaced in a never-ending stream. The more you receive, the more you can give, and the more you give, the more you are capable of receiving. It is then that giving and receiving become one. Does anybody ever had sort of a peak experience like he's describing, in this? I mean, it kind of reminds me a little bit of sort of the plant medicine experiences that I've had to some degree. There's this kind of overwhelming, like mystical vision of, reality that is, this abundance surrounding you and flowing through you. And, it's like it has all of this, abundance and limitless love. So it's kind of, it's great to try to, connect with that foundation. And, it's like we can't make it happen, right? But there are ways in which, we can just keep removing whatever might be the blocks in the way of that we feel, where we stay tense, where we distrust, where we, hold out ourselves in some way, hold in. Withhold, I guess is the word I was looking for, ourselves. So
It's a real flow state.
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So the first step must be to risk giving out. Consider that the fear that makes you hold and hoard is erroneous. Test once again a new ground rule of life and begin gradually to discard the old one that has proven detrimental because it has painted a false picture of life. So in a way, this is also kind of how we challenge our images, right? And that's kind of what he's talking about. So, we have this erroneous belief and it causes us to kind of hoard or withhold. And he's saying, so test it, see what really does happen if you can simply offer something, kind of forthcoming from yourself in a certain situation. Maybe if you tell spirit you're willing, and you want to experiment with that, those circumstances will, arise for you to, test. But it's like, if you've been in this place of not giving, you could also just feel into that a lot and say, what is it that doesn't feel like it wants to give? Because that's kind of our natural state. And there's a great deal of healing and understanding that could happen and meeting of, sort of wounded parts if we can connect with, this no to giving, and understand where it originated, right? And then again, like the more that we can offer the giving, it's kind of like priming the pump. And so we have to be willing to prime the pump and start with this, positive action, even if maybe we don't feel it completely, and risk challenging our expectations, right? And see if we can have just a little bit of an open mind to, well, maybe what I have always thought was going to happen might not. So, anything else? Did I hear somebody? So, so test once again a new ground rule of life and begin gradually to discard the old one that has proven detrimental because it has painted a false picture of life. False pictures are reinforced by belief, just as true pictures are. Only when they are questioned do they lose their energy. Challenging them is like pulling out poisonous weeds and planting new beautiful seedlings. When you give in faith, love, and trust in God, even before you are convinced that your fear of giving out is unwarranted, you have already begun to plant your new, abundant, rich, beautiful spiritual garden. When I say spiritual, I do not mean something far away, vague, and realizable only in the afterlife. I mean something tangible that must sooner or later manifest in your material life here and now with the inner and outer riches. So yeah, it's a beautiful image, I think, and I've run across it in other circles, of like we're tending a garden within us, right? And so we're caring for this garden and we're trying to help it grow and nurturing it and that sort of thing. Now I come to yet another obstacle to establishing the benign circle in which you flow in harmony with creation and live in divine order and in divine grace. This obstacle is very important, yet seldom recognized for what it is. It exists on all levels, on the inner emotional, psychological, spiritual, and personal levels, as well as on the outer, general, universal, and collective levels. This topic is chosen at this time not only to help you personally on your individual path, but also to help you establish the new model of world government within your ever-growing community. Now, I had forgotten that this was in this lecture, so it'd be interesting to review it again. This obstacle is a tendency in human nature to build on deficit, a tendency intrinsically connected with the belief in an empty, poor, ungiving universe. And sometimes I wonder, like our fear and our angst, for the earth and what we've done to her. And I mean, I think it's real, but it's kind of like that reinforces this feeling of, like, and so I think it helps to remind me to go out and see, the abundance and, nature struggles, we had some downpours that weren't, very good for the ground. And, it's just kind of always in a little bit of this challenging thing, but, it is so ever abundant. And so again, when we come from the fear and the lack, I think there's something that, they're pointing to about that is kind of co-creative. And so if that's where we're coming from, that might be something more of what we will manifest. So he says, let me now be more explicit. Take at first the personal inner levels. When you build positive beliefs and life patterns on top of unconscious or semi-conscious negative beliefs, you build on a deficit. So this is good. He's saying, we got to get into the shadow. We can't just put whipped cream on top of bullshit. We got to, know ourselves and take responsibility for all the levels of our being. And most of the negativity, shouldn't be judged. It's like we just need to know that, it's coming out of pain states and defenses. And so what it needs is protection, and it needs faith in itself and in the world, right? And so this is part of what we're trying to do, is just recall and remember. And like the guide says, we always look for the negative. So it is like consciously go out and see the abundance everywhere, or consciously remember or call to mind everything you're grateful for. right? Gratitude is kind of one of those channels that helps us remember the truth of abundance in the universe. And so when you secretly believe that you are a totally unlovable and unacceptable human being, and hopefully we're getting, a lot of people have grown from that, but you might even remember when you felt that way, and maybe you still feel that way somewhat, or maybe a lot. So, but that's a kind of building on a deficit. And when your real and false guilts prevent you from turning yourself fully over to God, you build on a deficit. So, we don't realize always that, there's a kind of one of the blocks to feeling this tender God and tender universe is our false guilts and our real guilts as well, where we do feel unworthy. And so instead of like running into the arms of this tender loving father when we're in distress, we feel like we're bad, we're unworthy, we didn't do it right, so he won't hold us, right? And so this is again not the truth about how God is, right? And so if we can challenge that idea, and kind of really build a sense of, there's really a lot of support, our whole life, we've always had that support. The angels have walked with us, they've been with us through our crises, and there's going to be more, and we're all going to die. And yet, there's a way that, we can, still give thanks to our mother and our father, right? And the more that we trust, even in this deep unknown journey into death, right? The more, that we have to use the faith. I mean, we don't know what it's, but then if we're just present and we just walk it and we just stay in our hearts and do the best we can, then I think we will be supported. And even a transition like that could be miraculous, beautiful, who knows, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Building on deficit can appear to succeed for a while. That is the trouble. What is false seems to work for a while and becomes temporarily convincing. He who builds a house on unsafe sandy ground may indeed erect a lovely looking structure that holds up for a while. When it begins to crumble, the builder cannot see the connection because he may have shut off his awareness of having chosen to build on such a weak foundation. The crumbling of the house may then be ascribed to different causes. Such rationalizations only maintain the illusory picture of life and encourage the tendency of building on a deficit. So the methods I have given you to work with on your path are meant to bring your deficits to the surface of your consciousness. They prevent you from ignoring the deficits. This path is directly designed to create an inner order, painful as this may be at first, so that you can begin to build on real assets and never allow your inner economics to become fraudulent and unsound. The temporary pain of exposing your debts, your deficits, comes from the wrong conclusion that by doing so you are doomed to accept the reality of your poverty. You cannot trust that your unsound managing can be changed, that you can indeed create real riches based on a healthy policy. You are constantly running on deficit, giving out in a distorted way that has nothing to do with genuine giving. This is pretended giving in more than one way. For example, you either project your masked self to the world while you are inwardly despair about who you believe you really are, or you give out in order to accumulate in a manipulative way what you believe you do not deserve. These types of lower self-giving are manifestations of building on deficit. False ways of giving may temporarily work on the surface, but as your deficits increase inwardly, you cover up the impoverishment you have created in order to avoid the necessary bankruptcy. You grab outer, temporary, unsound means to coast along on pretense and cherish the illusion that you can go on indefinitely in this way. Then you build a mask illusion on a lower self illusion. The mask illusion is that this way of operating can go on forever. The lower self illusion is that the world is mean and poor. To put it differently, you believe only in the illusory wealth acquired through scheming, pretense, and greed, and not in the real wealth of God's creation. And this is a lot, I think, in this materialism and this, increased, materialistic kind of focus in the world right now is, also a piece of this. And so in practical terms, this manifests in putting so much energy in your mask and lower self that you never dare expose your deficits and the inner bankruptcy that smolders underground. When you work with your helpers and peers and bring all your guilts, all your lower self machinations to the fore, you stand there poor. You no longer cover up with a false veneer. You no longer try to avoid the poverty you have unwittingly created through false belief by destructive means that only increase the deficit. Then the fear and resistance to declaring the bankruptcy that you had frantically covered up is finally overcome through your faith. And then you can begin to create the sound new order of your inner wealth that has waited for this moment to manifest and enrich you. So, there's a way in which the fear and resistance, to declaring the bankruptcy, it's like in one way I've been reading this, sort of as the deficit is the belief in our not enoughness, right? And that sort of thing. But here he's saying that, in that we then compensate in some way, and so we try to avoid this poverty that we have created, by sort of these, trying to be more than we are, better than we are, or, controlling things, or, working with it, from the will and the defense. And so he's saying the real answer is not in that, but it's in exposure, and also in sort of this, way that, we can just be humble and real, like the real self, is always a mixture of our divine aspects and, the defenses and other things. And in a way, we have to just humbly be both. One doesn't rule out the other. Somehow they need to integrate. And so we have, a higher self that doesn't reject, but accepts and maybe works with the lower self. And we have a lower self that has reasons for being and qualities and, things in it that I think when it is kind of like deeply seen and embraced, actually, like the guide says, all our lower self qualities were the original divine higher self qualities. And so when they're integrated and embraced, then they are allowed to transform more into their positive and divine original nature.
It seems that would be the only way we can receive in order to have something to give. We have to get real.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like too much. I mean, the ego wants to do it by itself. It's like,
Right.
and
Right.
it thinks that in order to do that, it has to be a certain way and have this and that, and so it's always kind of managing itself through the will and through its ideas of what it has to be or needs to be and that kind of thing. And so that's basically the idealized self-image, right? And that can be very self-alienating. I mean, basically that's what the guide calls the idealized self-image. It's like it's the alienated self, right? It's not even our real self at all. It's an alienation. So yeah, so the more we can become the real self, and that's the only thing that can receive or give, like you said. And if we give from that false self, we're not giving what we think we're giving.
Right. Yeah.
So your spiritual and emotional finances often manifest on the material level as well. So again, oftentimes, like our internal emotional gets reflected in various ways in the external. Many people live above their means. They coast on debts. They cover one hole with another newly created hole. Although they live in a constant climate of anxiety, they refuse to create order because they do not believe that order and abundance can exist for them, and they are unwilling to give. Perhaps they do not want to give by paying the necessary price, which may be giving their best to their work. Thus, they cannot make a decent livelihood. They depend on others and accumulate debts. However, the inner process of your pathwork in certain cases finally reaches the outer levels of material manifestation. You have even created budget sessions for those who manifest their inner deficit on the outer level. In that way, you create a new sound order and you no longer have to run on deficit. Budget sessions, though they deal with the outer manifestations, exactly replicate the pathwork you do on the inner psychological and spiritual levels. My beloved friends, it is extremely important for you to see that finances, economics, collective governmental procedures follow exactly the same patterns. They are sound when government is built on assets, not on deficit, on reserves, not on debts, on fullness, not on emptiness. For those of you who have some knowledge of the way governments, national and international, are run, it will be easy to see how the principle I speak about applies to the outer collective level as much as to the inner personal ones. Whenever a country goes through severe crises, riots, revolution, war, financial collapse, it is a result of waiting too long to establish cleanliness, order, truth, voluntarily, through deliberate choices, by working things out in controlled circumstances. It is the result of not wanting to expose the deficit so the true abundance can follow. Such governmental crisis can be likened to the breakdown of an individual who refuses to expose his or her inner poverty, pretense, and deficit. When government practice predominantly injustice, live on greed and power drive, when they scheme and lie to deceive the people, they always create not only a spiritual deficit, but also inevitably a material one. The thus established imbalances can be covered up only for so long. Eventually, they must all surface, so that a new order can be established. When countries go through such crises, changes are often brought about with the best intentions at first. New laws and modalities are created, new collective measures and forms of government. But when the inner meaning gets lost again, the same deficit will arise through different means. The forces of darkness can again distort the truth and tempt people away from the inner truth of God. Again, their vision will be blurred so that new deficits will accumulate. Thus, the solution never lies only in the form of government you adopt or the outer measures you institute, although admittedly some measures are better than others at different times. If you take a very close and well-informed look at various governments, you will soon see where and how their deficits are created. Sometimes the direct material deficits are obvious in a particular country's economics. It is clear that the government avoids temporary exposure by frantically pretending, coasting along, trying to cover one hole after another, never daring to trust a real wealth which could be reestablished. In such a situation, it is too frightening to admit the imbalance and mismanagement. When sufficient faith is lacking, the false world picture of a poor, untrustworthy, empty universe makes this next step toward honesty impossible. Taking this step is possible only through God with total faith, by going to and with God. Risking to have faith can create faith, and also the experience that having faith is justified. It is therefore foolish to assume that a balanced, harmonious, abundant world order in which justice and peace exist can be established without a direct communication with the divine world and the Christ within and around you. If you ignore his existence, you cannot perceive his presence, nor can you hear his guidance, advice, and loving inspiration. Thus, you cannot summon up the courage you need to go through the temporary exposure of inner bankruptcy, which is often also outer bankruptcy, both in individuals and in countries. The shambles can be collected and the structure rebuilt in a better way only when all participants are seriously filled with the purest of motives and directly ask God's eternal presence to help and inspire them. This is the hope of the world in which you live. Everything that is undertaken without God, no matter how intelligent and efficient it may seem at first, is bound to fail in the long run. Only through and with God can you have the courage and honesty to trust total openness. Rebuilding can then begin in earnest and in glory. Only then will all governments run on assets. Only then can they function healthily, with a constant, balanced flow of giving and receiving, never exhausting the reserves because all is based on truth, justice, and fairness. No country will then deny the other its resources. Mutual pressure and power plays will not corrupt the world that was created by God, so that all can partake of everything, no matter where it originates. Why do you think God has distributed resources so that some are in certain parts of the world only and others in other parts? The wisdom of the Creator disposes according to deepest reasons and meanings. Never is anything just an accident. The reason for the distribution of the world's resources is to help people to share and to consider all other people. This will enable them also to freely receive what they need and what others have. Right here, you can see how a spiritual law works on the most practical levels. Giving and receiving can exist when countries share their resources rather than hoarding them and using them to gain more power and riches, regardless of how many people will be deprived. My beloved friends, these are the principles that you need to establish in your community. In the way you will become a true model. Let me now say a few words about the process and give you some guidance. The details you need to work out yourselves. You need to make yourselves channels for God's will in every detail. But some guidelines are also necessary. I was recently asked a question that deals with this topic. You have become aware of a certain imbalance within your structure. So I think this is kind of going into a particular question around the community there at the time. Let me see. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm a little lost in what he's talking about here, but you have become aware of a certain imbalance within your structure. Balance is constantly changed when one side outweighs the other in the development of an individual as well as that of a collective organism. Balances need to be constantly re-examined and adjusted in order to establish inner and outer harmony, health, and honesty, acquired wealth. That is divine abundance. So boy, this sounds like it's talking right to our times, right? And there's a way that, it is, that we don't get this part, and so we're kind of really taking us out. But that's probably what needs to happen for something new to come in. And it is this, imbalance, and this feeling like, oh, like, the more that a few have the most, the better we are. All of that, it can't continue. The imbalance on the earth, everything. Our relationship with life is, kind of highly distorted in the collective. But I think, that the journey that we're on now is really sort of like the guide says, sometimes this works for a little while and then it won't anymore. And so I think we're coming close to the time that this, collective deficit that we're living in and on is going to dissolve. So you need to examine when the individual needs to give more to the collective entity, and then when the process can be reversed and the collective entity can give more to the individual. You must never live above your means, function out of fullness, do not run on deficit. This should not be done in a spirit of anxiety and lack of trust. It is possible to have faith and yet not use misapplied faith to justify the current tendency of your will to function on deficit. At the same time, you need to establish priorities in a deep way. There may be temporary situations when a deficit on the material level may be unavoided until a sound basis of fullness and functioning on assets is established. If you keep this goal in mind, you will attain it. It may be necessary to keep your budget smaller than you may wish. It may mean that you as a community may have to temporarily do without something you may like to think of as essential until you can truly afford it. You may have to reconsider what is and what is not essential, and look at it from the point of view of the work that is being done and with a view of the task that is being fulfilled on a larger scale. Temporarily, more of you may have to pitch in with your giving, as some have done from the very beginning. Without it, you would not have the community as it exists today. The law fulfilled itself clearly in that none have come to deprivation from their giving. Quite the contrary, more abundance has accrued for them. When more of you adopt this spirit, more abundance will be created for those who give and for the collective entity. Until the latter will be sufficiently healthy on all levels, including the material one, so that it can in turn give more and more to the individuals in question. But do not ever forget, even when spiritual and material health and abundance are firmly rooted, that each new person who desires to commit himself or herself to stage 4, or in other terms, the third level of development, that of nurturing others, needs to go through a period of giving without much recompense. So in this step, if this step is skipped, the spiritual health of the community will suffer, and that will eventually affect its material health. A lot will change with this new outlook. You will lose that slight anxiety that keeps nagging you because you are still groping in the dark about how to establish an economy that functions on assets rather than on deficit. You must understand that this duplicates exactly the inner process of an individual on the path. However, if the concept and vision are lacking, the outer picture may not immediately or speedily manifest the inner order that already exists. Often a problem needs to be tackled from both sides. You need to deepen your inner work on the spiritual and psychological levels and purify what runs on deficit. At the same time, you need to also realize a similar process in your personal financial affairs. Budget sessions are an integral part of this aspect. Last but not least, the same principles need to be established for the material affairs of the collective entity. This then is true harmony. Your entire path in all its workings will function smoothly and richly. You will have more abundance than that is well earned, honestly deserved, and can thus be guiltlessly enjoyed. The abundance will benefit many, and among other things will also make it possible for those who need to be materially sustained at the beginning to have scholarships until they become self-sustaining. This lecture goes, of course, way beyond the factual advice at the end of it. You need to deeply understand the divine law and principle. You need to recognize all obstructions that prevent you from perceiving and partaking of ever-present divine grace. Then you can release the faith that is within you, that is realistic because it is an experience of what is, and not a belief in and hope for what might be illusory wishful thinking. My dearest ones, Christ's embrace enfolds all of you and accompanies you in all your doings and in all your thinking. You are blessed. Okay. That was quite a lecture, huh?
Yeah, good one.
Yeah, I'm going to have to reread it. There's some important points in there. I think that's why I was called to it. You know, there's some stuff going on that this is totally connected with. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You were quiet, Chuck. Anything to?
No, the only thing that came up for me is at the beginning is a phrase that I heard a while back that seems to apply to this concept, to some of what the lecture was talking about, and that's the notion of moving from the idea that life happens to me to life happens for me.
Yeah.
And that if life happens for me, even the vicissitudes are, and if you factor in cause and effect, don't put effect before the cause, then if there's difficulties, that's calling me to make some changes in the way that I think or act or whatever. And if I believe that everything's happening for me, that that incrementally I'll get to that place of pleasure supreme.
Yeah, right. And it feels like, not only is it's kind of happening for me, but also, it's responding in a way, it's mirroring or it's challenging, or it's like, and that can be, like what we don't want, but it's still like what you're saying, if you can recognize that everything that is happening is your creation, is self-response, like it's like nothing is happening to you, right? This
Right.
is,
And I this came to me during the process of dealing with my serious illness,
yeah.
and whether I lived or died, I was at peace with the idea that I was better off, that that I had learned a whole bunch going through the process,
Hmm. Yeah.
and that and so it also reinforces the idea of how important it is to accept what is as it is.
Mhm.
Such a great challenge, to surrender to what is.
Yeah, and but without the gloss that everything's okay
Right.
in the moment, that we don't, that there's not pain, suffering, fear, and anxiety, but that those things are, that's information we can use.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. And yeah, and I don't think it's to take it lightly in the way of kind of dismissing it, right? Or dismissing yourself in whatever is happening, and whatever's there, because I think again, like to me this spiritual knowledge, the more I can embody it and live it, the better. But even when I don't fully, when I have other parts of me that are still embodying other realities in a way, have this deficit, have these other pieces, like underlying all of that, I know this foundation, right? And so it's kind of like I'm grounded in that foundation, and then these other feelings can surface temporarily to be acknowledged, to, not have to deny my humanness or, suppress anything in me, right? But allow there's voices. And I find again in this process, when I simply acknowledge them as well, they're part of what is, right? And
Yeah, I think, I
go ahead.
think that being able to, not be a victim and to not be in denial.
Right, exactly, both sides of that coin, yeah. So it's happening for us, and then we don't have to like love it. Even if it is happening for us, we can still think, well, this sucks.
Yeah, and maybe, maybe a better way, you know, that I've thought about it is that life creates opportunities.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And oftentimes I wonder, why is this happening to me? And the answer that I always hear is because life needs you to feel something. What is it triggering in you? What is it bringing up? It wouldn't happen except that you need to pay attention and become aware of this energy that arises in you around these things, right? So again, it's telling me exactly where my work is. It's leading me right into the process that is sort of the next piece that I need to. And there's this sense that it knows that I might rebel for a while, but eventually, like there will be this integration of all of this, right? Okay, well, enjoyed it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Take care.
Um,